Picture David Hume, the 18th-century Scottish philosopher who spent his career systematically dismantling human pretensions to knowledge, sitting in his Edinburgh study with a copy of Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape. The man who argued that we can never truly know anything, not causation, not the external world, not even our own selves, watching someone confidently declare that science can determine human values with mathematical precision. The irony would not merely amuse Hume, it would absolutely delight him. Sam Harris has built an entire intellectual career on what amounts to a systematic misunderstanding of Hume's most fundamental insights. He quotes Hume approvingly, particularly the famous is-ought problem, then proceeds to construct elaborate philosophical systems that Hume would dismantle with the methodical precision of a master surgeon. It's like watching someone quote Newton while trying to build a perpetual motion machine. The respect for the authority figure makes the fundamental error even more glaring. But this isn't an academic exercise in pointing out philosophical inconsistencies. Harris's project represents something far more ambitious and therefore far more problematic, an attempt to ground objective morality in scientific methodology while simultaneously claiming to respect the very philosophical insights that make such grounding impossible. He's not just wrong, he's systematically, and almost beautifully wrong in ways that would provide Hume with endless entertainment. Hume's contribution to moral philosophy through the is-ought problem is perhaps one of the most elegant philosophical insights ever formulated. In the Treatise of Human Nature, he observes that authors move seamlessly from descriptive statements about what is to prescriptive statements about what ought to be, without ever explaining this logical leap. This observation, later dubbed Hume's guillotine, doesn't just separate facts from values, it demonstrates that such separation is logically necessary. Harris's entire project in the moral landscape is essentially a 300-page attempt to escape Hume's guillotine through what can only be described as philosophical sleight of hand. He argues that science can determine human values because human flourishing is not merely a value but a measurable fact about conscious creatures. Well-being, he claims, exists on a moral landscape with peaks and valleys that can be mapped scientifically. Hume would be absolutely fascinated by this maneuver, and then proceed to demolish it. "My dear Mr. Harris," Hume might begin, "you speak of human flourishing as though it were as self-evident as the law of gravity. But pray tell, why should rational beings value flourishing over, say, authentic suffering? Or noble sacrifice? Or even beautiful decay? You assume that well-being is inherently good, but this assumption, this foundational value judgment, cannot be derived from any empirical observation whatsoever. You've simply smuggled in your moral premise and dressed it up in the respectable clothing of neuroscience. The problem runs deeper than mere question-begging. Harris commits what we might call the definitional fallacy. He defines morality in terms of well-being, then argues that science can determine morality because it can measure well-being. This is like defining tall as over 6 feet and then claiming you've solved the problem of objective height standards. The definition itself contains the value judgment Harris pretends to derive scientifically. Consider Harris's favorite example, the Taliban's treatment of women. Harris argues this is objectively wrong because it causes suffering and reduces well-being. But Hume would immediately spot the logical error. Harris assumes that causing suffering is wrong, but this assumption cannot be scientifically verified. A Taliban member might argue that temporary earthly suffering is justified if it prevents eternal spiritual suffering, and science cannot adjudicate between these competing value systems because science cannot determine which forms of suffering matter most or whether suffering is inherently bad. Harris's confidence in measuring well-being scientifically would particularly amuse Hume, who spent considerable effort showing that even our most basic concepts resist objective measurement. In the inquiry concerning human understanding, Hume argues that we can never actually observe causation, we only observe temporal succession and infer causation through habit and custom. If we cannot even measure causation reliably, how can we possibly measure something as complex and subjective as human well-being? Harris points to neuroscience, brain imaging, and behavioral studies, but Hume would immediately identify the fundamental problems with this approach. First, there's the problem of interpersonal comparison. Harris assumes that brain states corresponding to well-being are comparable across individuals, but this assumption is scientifically unverifiable. When person A reports happiness level 8 and person B reports happiness level 8, are their experiences actually equivalent? Science cannot answer this question because subjective experience is, by definition, subjective. Second, there's the temporal problem. Harris assumes that well-being can be measured at discrete moments and that these measurements reflect genuine well-being. But Hume would ask, how do we know that momentary brain states correspond to genuine flourishing? Perhaps true well-being can only be evaluated over a complete lifetime, or perhaps it requires a kind of reflective distance that momentary measurement cannot capture. Third, there's the cultural problem. Harris's conception of well-being is deeply influenced by Western, secular, individualistic values. He assumes that autonomy, pleasure, and freedom from suffering constitute well-being, but these assumptions are culturally specific. A Buddhist might argue that attachment to pleasure causes suffering, while a Stoic might argue that well-being comes from accepting suffering. Science cannot determine which cultural framework is correct because the definition of well-being is precisely what's in dispute. Hume's skepticism about induction, the idea that we can never be certain that future events will resemble past ones, would extend naturally to Harris's moral science. Harris argues that we can use neuroscience and psychology to determine what makes humans flourish, but this assumes that human nature is constant and that laboratory findings translate to real-world situations. You measure brain states and correlate them with reports of well-being, Hume might say, but how do you know these measurements will remain valid? How do you know that what appears to cause flourishing in your controlled laboratory environment will do so in the messy complexity of human life? You're making the same inductive leap that plagues all human knowledge, assuming the future will resemble the past, that laboratory conditions reflect real-world conditions, that current human nature reflects permanent human nature. This problem becomes particularly acute when we consider Harris's policy recommendations. He argues that certain social arrangements are objectively better because they promote well-being, but this assumes that human responses to social arrangements remain constant across time and context. History suggests otherwise. Social practices that promoted well-being in one era often become sources of suffering in another. Consider marriage. Harris might argue that stable pair bonding promotes well-being based on current psychological research. But human attitudes toward marriage have changed dramatically over time, and what promoted well-being in agricultural societies might not do so in post-industrial societies. Science cannot determine whether current attitudes toward marriage reflect permanent human nature or temporary cultural adaptation. Harris often argues that moral relativism is not just wrong but dangerous, that some moral views are simply better than others because they promote human flourishing. This argument commits what Hume would recognize as a particularly sophisticated version of the naturalistic fallacy. You argue that because certain practices lead to suffering, they are therefore wrong, Hume might note. But this assumes that suffering is inherently bad, a value judgment that cannot be empirically verified. You've created a circular argument. Suffering is bad because it reduces well-being, and reduced well-being is bad because it increases suffering. At no point have you provided a non-circular justification for why well-being should be valued. The problem becomes even more acute when we consider Harris's treatment of competing moral frameworks. He dismisses religious moral systems as pre-scientific and argues that secular, utilitarian approaches are superior because they're based on evidence rather than faith. But this argument assumes that evidence-based reasoning is superior to faith-based reasoning, itself a value judgment that cannot be scientifically justified. A religious person might argue that earthly well-being is less important than spiritual salvation, that temporary suffering serves important spiritual purposes, or that human reason is too limited to determine moral truth. Harris cannot refute these positions scientifically because they involve fundamental disagreements about what kinds of evidence matter and what kinds of goals are worth pursuing. One of Hume's most radical and enduring insights was that reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions. This directly contradicts Harris's entire project, which assumes that reason, via science, can and should determine our values. Harris argues that we can rationally determine what we should value by studying what actually promotes human flourishing. But Hume would find this approach fundamentally backwards. We first have passions, desires, emotions, sentiments, and then use reason to figure out how to satisfy them. Reason alone can never generate values or motivate action. Mr. Harris, Hume might say, you speak as though reason could generate values ex nihilo, like a philosopher's stone transmuting base facts into golden oughts. But reason alone can never motivate action. We must first care about something, and that caring is not itself rational. You care about reducing suffering, but this care cannot be justified by science any more than my preference for strawberry over vanilla can be scientifically validated. This insight has profound implications for Harris's project. If Hume is correct that reason serves the passions, then Harris's attempt to use reason to determine our ultimate values gets human psychology exactly backwards. We don't first figure out what we should value and then develop emotional attachments to those values. We first have emotional responses, sympathy, compassion, revulsion, and then use reason to systematize and implement those responses. Harris's own moral commitments seem to bear this out. His passionate advocacy for reducing suffering doesn't stem from scientific reasoning but from his natural human sympathy, the same sentiment Hume identified as the foundation of moral judgment. When Harris argues against torture or religious extremism, he's not deriving his position from neuroscience but expressing deeply held emotional commitments that he then attempts to justify scientifically. Harris's advocacy for meditation and contemplative practices would particularly puzzle Hume. Having argued that the self is nothing but a bundle of perceptions, with no underlying substance, Hume would be amused by Harris's faith in meditative insight as a source of moral knowledge. You claim that meditation reveals the illusory nature of the self, Hume might observe, and in this we agree. But then you proceed to treat the insights gained through meditation as though they were objective truths about reality. How can an illusory self gain genuine knowledge about anything, much less moral truth? If the self is indeed an illusion, then meditative insights are simply one bundle of perceptions commenting on another bundle of perceptions, no more objectively valid than any other subjective experience. Harris often describes meditation as a form of spiritual technology that can provide direct insight into the nature of consciousness and morality. But Hume would question whether such experiences have any epistemic value whatsoever. Having spent considerable effort showing that our beliefs about causation, the external world, and personal identity are all based on habit and custom rather than reason or direct experience, Hume would be deeply skeptical of claims about transcendent moral truths discovered through introspection. The problem becomes even more acute when we consider Harris's claim that meditation can reveal objective moral truths. If consciousness is simply a stream of perceptions without any underlying observer, then meditative states are just different arrangements of perceptions. Why should some arrangements of perceptions, meditative insights, be considered more truthful than others, ordinary moral intuitions? Furthermore, Harris's description of spiritual experiences often sounds remarkably similar to what Hume would classify as enthusiasm, the mistake of treating intense subjective experiences as objective revelations. Hume was deeply suspicious of religious enthusiasm precisely because it confused the intensity of subjective experience with the validity of the beliefs associated with that experience. Harris's hard determinism, his view that free will is an illusion, would both align with and trouble Hume. While Hume was himself a compatibilist who questioned libertarian free will, he was much more nuanced about the relationship between determinism and moral responsibility. Hume would appreciate Harris's insight that ultimate moral responsibility is impossible if our actions are determined by prior causes beyond our control. However, he would question Harris's confidence in making strong moral judgments while simultaneously denying moral responsibility. If Hitler's actions were as determined as the orbit of planets, Hume might ask, then in what sense can we say his actions were wrong rather than simply unfortunate? You cannot have it both ways. Either moral responsibility exists and moral judgments make sense, or determinism is true and moral language becomes merely expressive of our feelings rather than descriptive of objective facts. This tension runs throughout Harris's work. He argues passionately that certain actions and beliefs are objectively wrong, but his deterministic worldview suggests that people cannot be ultimately responsible for their actions or beliefs. This creates a paradox. If people cannot help believing what they believe or doing what they do, what's the point of moral argument at all? Harris attempts to resolve this paradox by arguing that moral argument itself is part of the causal chain that determines behavior. By providing better reasons and evidence, we can influence people's actions even if they're not ultimately responsible for them. But this resolution fails to address the deeper problem. If moral judgments are merely causal interventions rather than assessments of responsibility, then the language of right and wrong becomes misleading. Perhaps most fundamentally, Hume would question Harris's faith in science as a means of discovering moral truth. Having spent his career showing the limits of human knowledge in general, Hume would be deeply skeptical of any claim that empirical methods could resolve fundamental questions about how we should live. Science, Hume might note, is merely organized habit. We observe regularities in nature and assume they will continue, but this assumption itself cannot be scientifically justified. Science works not because it discovers objective truths but because it systematizes our expectations based on past experience. How then can science, which cannot even justify its own methods, hope to determine the ultimate values by which we should live? This critique goes to the heart of Harris's project. Science is remarkably successful at describing and predicting natural phenomena, but this success depends on assumptions that cannot be scientifically validated, that nature is uniform, that the future will resemble the past, that our sensory experiences correspond to external reality, that rational methods are superior to irrational ones. These assumptions work well for understanding the physical world, but they become problematic when applied to questions of value and meaning. Why should we assume that moral truths exist independently of human judgment? Why should we assume that rational methods are superior to intuitive or traditional methods for determining how we should live? Why should we assume that human well-being is the appropriate standard for moral judgment? Harris cannot answer these questions scientifically because they involve the very assumptions that make scientific inquiry possible. He's like a carpenter trying to build a house while standing on the foundation he's attempting to construct. The project is doomed from the start. What would Hume propose instead? Not moral relativism, despite common misunderstanding, but a more modest approach based on human nature and sentiment rather than scientific reasoning. Hume believed that moral judgments arise from our natural sympathies and sentiments. We disapprove of cruelty not because science tells us it's wrong, but because we naturally feel sympathy for those who suffer. We approve of kindness not because it maximizes utility, but because it triggers our natural sentiments of approbation. These moral sentiments are not arbitrary or culturally relative in the way Harris fears. They arise from our nature as social beings who depend on cooperation for survival. While cultural variations exist, the basic human capacity for sympathy, fairness, and reciprocity appears to be universal. Mr. Harris, Hume might conclude, you seek to ground morality in science, but you need look no further than human nature itself. We are naturally sympathetic beings who care about others' welfare. This is not a scientific discovery but a fact about our psychological constitution. Build your ethics on this foundation, and you'll find it more solid than any scientific theory. This approach has several advantages over Harris's scientific morality. First, it doesn't require solving the is-ought problem because it doesn't claim to derive values from facts. Instead, it recognizes that values arise from our nature as feeling beings. Second, it doesn't require measuring subjective well-being because it grounds morality in intersubjective sentiment rather than objective measurement. Third, it doesn't require assuming that science can determine ultimate values because it recognizes that values emerge from human nature rather than scientific discovery. Harris often argues that moral relativism is dangerous because it prevents us from criticizing harmful practices in other cultures. He points to examples like female genital mutilation, honor killings, and religious extremism as evidence that some moral views are simply better than others. But Hume would question whether Harris's approach actually solves the problem of cultural variation. If moral truth depends on scientific measurement of well-being, then we need universal standards for what constitutes well-being. But these standards inevitably reflect the cultural assumptions of the scientists making the measurements. Consider Harris's claim that religious practices are inferior to secular ones because they often involve beliefs unsupported by evidence. This assumes that evidence-based reasoning is superior to faith-based reasoning, but this assumption reflects specifically Western, Enlightenment values. Members of traditional religious cultures might argue that spiritual insight, revealed truth, or ancestral wisdom are more reliable guides to human flourishing than scientific reasoning. Harris cannot resolve this disagreement scientifically because the disagreement concerns the very methods and standards that count as scientific. He's trapped in what philosophers call the problem of the criterion. To determine which moral views are correct, we need criteria for correctness, but to establish criteria for correctness, we need to know which moral views are correct. Harris places enormous faith in neuroscience as a tool for understanding morality, but Hume would be deeply skeptical of this approach. Having argued that we can never actually observe the connections between mental states and physical states, Hume would question whether brain scans can tell us anything meaningful about moral experience. You show me pictures of brains and claim they reveal the nature of moral judgment, Hume might observe, but how do you know that these colorful images correspond to actual moral experience? You're making the same mistake that Descartes made when he tried to locate the soul in the pineal gland, assuming that correlation implies causation and that physical states explain mental states. The problems with Harris's neuroscientific approach run deeper than mere correlation-causation confusion. First, brain imaging technology measures blood flow and electrical activity, not subjective experience. The leap from physical measurement to moral conclusion requires enormous assumptions about the relationship between brain states and mental states. Second, neuroscience can only study the brains of people who already have moral beliefs. It cannot determine whether those beliefs are correct. If we scan the brains of people who believe slavery is wrong and find certain patterns of neural activity, this tells us nothing about whether slavery is actually wrong. We might find similar patterns in people who believe slavery is right if we lived in a different historical period. Third, neuroscience cannot distinguish between moral truths and moral illusions. If our brains are programmed by evolution to have certain moral intuitions, neuroscience might reveal these intuitions without revealing whether they track objective moral facts. Harris assumes that evolved moral intuitions are likely to be correct, but this assumption cannot be scientifically validated. Harris often argues that we can trust our moral intuitions because they were shaped by evolution to promote cooperation and survival. But this evolutionary argument actually undermines Harris's project in several ways. First, evolution shapes our moral intuitions to promote reproductive success, not objective moral truth. If our ancestors benefited from believing false moral claims, perhaps because these beliefs promoted group cohesion, then evolution would have shaped us to believe false moral claims. The fact that we evolved to have certain moral intuitions provides no evidence that these intuitions are objectively correct. Second, evolution operates through group selection and individual selection, which often conflict. Behaviors that benefit individuals, like selfishness, may harm groups, while behaviors that benefit groups, like self-sacrifice, may harm individuals. Harris cannot determine which evolutionary pressures are morally relevant without making value judgments that cannot be scientifically justified. Third, evolution has equipped us with moral intuitions that conflict with Harris's utilitarian approach. We have strong intuitions about fairness, justice, and rights that cannot be reduced to calculations of well-being. We care about how well-being is distributed, not just how much well-being exists. We think some sources of well-being are more valuable than others. These intuitions create problems for Harris's simple maximization approach. Harris's advocacy for meditation creates a particularly acute problem for his scientific approach to morality. On one hand, he argues that science should determine our values through objective measurement and rational analysis. On the other hand, he argues that meditation provides direct insight into moral truth through subjective experience. These two approaches are fundamentally incompatible. Science relies on intersubjective verification, the idea that multiple observers can confirm the same results. Meditation relies on subjective experience, insights that cannot be verified by others. Science assumes that objective methods are superior to subjective methods. Meditation assumes that certain subjective experiences provide access to objective truths. Hume would be fascinated by this tension. Having argued that reason and passion play different roles in human psychology, he would recognize that Harris is trying to combine two incompatible approaches to knowledge. Science works by eliminating subjective bias and personal experience. Meditation works by cultivating subjective insight and personal experience. The problem becomes even more acute when we consider Harris's claim that meditation reveals the illusory nature of the self. If the self is indeed an illusion, then who or what is gaining moral insight through meditation? If there's no substantial self to have experiences, then what's the epistemological status of meditative insights? Harris sometimes suggests that meditation reveals objective features of consciousness that can be studied scientifically. But this move faces the same problems as his general approach. It assumes that subjective experiences can be objectively measured and that these measurements reveal moral truths. Harris's denial of free will creates another fundamental problem for his moral project. If people cannot freely choose their actions, then moral argument becomes pointless. Why write books trying to convince people to change their moral views if they cannot freely choose to adopt different views? Harris attempts to resolve this paradox by arguing that moral argument is itself part of the causal chain that determines behavior. By providing better reasons and evidence, we can influence people's beliefs and actions even if they're not ultimately free to choose them. But this resolution fails to address the deeper problem. If moral argument is just causal manipulation, then the distinction between good and bad arguments becomes unclear. Why is rational persuasion better than emotional manipulation or even coercion? If people cannot freely evaluate arguments, then the quality of arguments becomes irrelevant. All that matters is their causal effectiveness. Hume would recognize this as a version of the problem he faced with his own skeptical arguments. If reason cannot establish objective truth, then what's the point of rational argument? Hume resolved this tension by distinguishing between philosophical reflection and practical life. We cannot avoid acting as though our beliefs are true even if we cannot prove they are true. But Harris cannot adopt this strategy because his entire project depends on the possibility of objective moral knowledge. He cannot retreat into skeptical modesty because he's making strong claims about moral truth and scientific methodology. Harris often argues that moral progress is possible and that science can help us make such progress. He points to the abolition of slavery, the expansion of women's rights, and the development of human rights as evidence that moral views can improve over time. But Hume would question whether Harris's framework can actually account for moral progress. If moral truth depends on scientific measurement of well-being, then moral progress should involve increasingly accurate measurements of well-being. But historical moral progress seems to involve changes in what we count as morally relevant, not just better measurements of agreed-upon values. The abolition of slavery didn't result from better scientific understanding of well-being. It resulted from expanding our circle of moral concern to include previously excluded groups. The development of women's rights didn't result from discovering that women's well-being matters scientifically. It resulted from recognizing that women's well-being matters morally. These changes in moral concern cannot be scientifically validated because they involve fundamental disagreements about whose well-being matters and why. Science cannot tell us whether animals deserve moral consideration, whether future generations deserve moral consideration, or whether environmental preservation matters independently of human well-being. Perhaps most troubling, Harris's approach has potentially totalitarian implications that Hume would immediately recognize. If science can determine objective moral truth, then those who understand the science have legitimate authority to impose their values on others. Harris explicitly argues that some moral views are not just different but objectively wrong and that society should not tolerate objectively wrong moral views. You speak of objective moral truth, Hume might observe, but who will determine what counts as objective? You assume that scientists will be objective arbiters of moral truth, but scientists are human beings with their own values, biases, and interests. Give them the authority to determine moral truth, and they will inevitably impose their own values while claiming scientific objectivity. This problem becomes particularly acute when we consider Harris's treatment of religious belief. He argues that religious moral views are inferior to scientific moral views because they're based on faith rather than evidence. But this assumes that secular, scientific approaches to morality are inherently superior to religious approaches, itself a controversial value judgment. Harris cannot resolve this problem by appealing to better scientific methods because the problem concerns the very assumption that scientific methods are appropriate for moral questions. Religious people might argue that spiritual insight, revealed truth, or traditional wisdom are more reliable guides to moral truth than scientific reasoning. Finally, Harris's entire project may be self-refuting. He argues that science can determine objective moral truth, but this argument cannot itself be scientifically validated. The claim that science should determine our values is itself a value claim that cannot be derived from scientific facts. Harris assumes that rational, evidence-based approaches to morality are superior to traditional, faith-based approaches. But this assumption involves the very kind of value judgment that Harris claims science can eliminate. He's using normative arguments to argue against normative arguments, a classic case of self-refutation. Hume would recognize this as a version of the problem that plagued logical positivism. The logical positivists argued that only empirically verifiable statements are meaningful, but this principle of verification is itself neither empirically verifiable nor logically necessary. Similarly, Harris argues that only scientifically grounded moral claims are valid, but this principle of scientific validation cannot be scientifically validated. Hume would regard Harris with a mixture of admiration and pity. Admiration for his genuine concern with reducing suffering and promoting human flourishing, goals that align perfectly with Hume's emphasis on human sympathy and benevolence. Pity for his systematic confusion about the nature of knowledge, science, and morality. My dear Mr. Harris, Hume might conclude, you have noble goals and admirable intentions, but you have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of both science and morality. Science is a powerful tool for understanding the natural world, but it cannot determine how we should live because it cannot bridge the gap between is and not. Morality arises from human nature, our capacity for sympathy, our social instincts, our emotional responses to suffering and flourishing. You already possess everything you need to build a meaningful ethics. Why complicate this simple truth with elaborate scientific theories that cannot bear the weight you place upon them? The tragedy of Harris's project is that it attempts to solve a problem that doesn't exist. He fears that without scientific grounding, morality becomes arbitrary and relativistic. But Hume showed that morality can be objective without being scientific. It can be grounded in universal features of human nature rather than scientific measurement. Harris is like a man who fears that aesthetic judgments are meaningless unless they can be scientifically validated. He spends enormous effort trying to measure beauty scientifically, never realizing that beauty's meaning comes from human response, not scientific measurement. The attempt to ground aesthetics in science misses the point entirely, and the same is true for morality. In trying to escape the supposed arbitrariness of human sentiment, Harris has created a system that is both more arbitrary and less human than the natural moral sense he's trying to replace. He's built a magnificent philosophical machine that cannot do the work he designed it to do, while ignoring the simple human capacities that we're already doing that work perfectly well. The irony is exquisite. In trying to make morality more scientific, Harris has made it less rational. In trying to make it more objective, he has made it more subjective. In trying to make it more universal, he has made it more parochial. Hume would appreciate the irony, smile at the confusion, and then invite Harris to dinner to discuss something more tractable, like whether we can ever really know if our moral sentiments tomorrow will resemble our moral sentiments today.